Welcome to the John Sherwood Memorial Lecture in the History of Science and Technology. John Sherwood was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1931 and passed away in 1986. He graduated from Columbia University and studied modern France on a Fulbright scholarship, publishing his master's thesis in St. Anthony's Papers 5 on the decline of the Third Republic. His major work, George Mandel and the Third Republic, was published with Stanford University Press. He then turned to the study of the history of technology, which was incomplete when he passed away. With the Department of History at Queen's for 22 years, he was strongly committed to teaching to students and to teaching. One of his most lasting contributions was setting up the first-year course, History 121, Introductory Origins of the Contemporary World, which was based on the Columbia University introductory course on Western civilization. It depended upon intense discussion and student participation in small classes, providing the kind of intense one-on-one interaction with professors that remains a challenge and a goal for any university curriculum to this day. His lasting memorial is in the students he influenced, the colleagues he impacted, and his family. Jacqueline at Zurich, Canada, Barbara, a professor of earth sciences at the University of Toronto, and Michelle, a lawyer in the Attorney General's office, and as well as an extended and tightly knit family, including the Sullivans, Kavanaughs, and past students, many of whom are with us for today's lecture. John Sherwood's concern with the relationship between technology and the humanities is commemorated in this lecture series, established with the support of his family, colleagues, and friends. Today's lecturer is Peter Deer. This year's lecturer is Peter Deer, Professor of History and of Science and Technology Studies at Cornell University. Peter Deer is the author or editor of numerous articles and books, including Discipline and Experience, The Mathematical Way in the Scientific Revolution, which received the Ludwig Fleck Prize from the History for Social Studies of Science, of Revolutionizing the Sciences, European Knowledge and Its Ambitions, which received the Helen and Miles Watson Davis Prize from the History of Science Society, and is a book I regularly use in the classroom, as well as he is the author as well as The Intelligibility of Nature: How Science Makes Sense of the World. He has won fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Guggenheim Foundation. On a more personal note, I first remember reading Discipline and Experience as a graduate student and being deeply impressed by the questions it raised regarding the nature of scientific explanation and persuasion, and experience itself as a category, combined with its lucid explanations of an utterly foreign world of scientific experimentation. And I find that this combination marks all of his writings, which I've done my best to keep up with over the years. So it is a great honor for me to welcome Peter Deer to speak to us today about the force of reason as a secular God in modernity. Please welcome him.
Okay, thanks very much. There's an interesting, although entirely routine phrase that the Oxford English Dictionary traces back to the early 17th century. The phrase is, "it stands to reason." Now, I've been interested in this apparently innocuous term, reason, for quite some time now, in relation to my particular scholarly concerns with the history of science and philosophy in early modern Europe. And this is an interest that really stems from my realizing that this term, reason, was one that I didn't really understand, particularly when it's used casually by present-day analytic philosophers, including philosophers of science. I once asked a philosopher what philosophers mean when they use terms like reason or reasonable or rational. And he said that it wasn't really clear what precisely such terms were being used to mean. And I took heart from this admission and began noticing these words in scholarly writing, but also and especially in the discussions of writers in early modern Europe, especially writers relating to the so-called scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries. What I found was that unlike most people today, many philosophers of that period worried about what reason is and why it should be reliable. This was valuable, of course, because it gave an insight into the sorts of considerations that helped to create the taken for granted uses of this thing called reason in later periods, down to the present day, in fact. If we understand better the sorts of assumptions and practices that were built into reason in the early modern period, we can be more alert to the things that we're unconsciously doing whenever we engage in easy talk about reason and rationality. People in the 17th century made it especially explicit because they worried about it. Conversely, by the 18th century, remarkably, that worry had to a considerable degree disappeared. Now, not long ago, there appeared from Lorraine Daston's group at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin a multiply authored book about Cold War systems research and related fields in the 1950s. And the main title of the book is obviously something designed to appeal to an editor. The title is How Reason Almost Lost Its Mind. And since it clearly is supposed to appeal to an editor, I won't take it too seriously. The subtitle, though, is a bit more revealing. The Strange Career of Cold War Rationality. Now, what I think this subtitle reveals is the idea that in itself reason, or slightly different rationality, is something that we usually take to be unproblematic, so that it's strange for rationality to appear strange. The assumption seems to be that if the use of rationality leads to what one might regard as unreasonable conclusions, then something must have gone wrong. Now, the kind of rationality that Daston's group is concerned with was one that focused on formal rules, which is in fact an approach with good historical antecedents. But rules of reason have long been understood, since well before Kantian approaches, as means of capturing something much less intangible, which is reason itself. Networks of rules to govern legitimate inference are historically common ways to try to crystallize and identify what reason is, precisely because the idea seems to refer to something so evanescent. And to anticipate a point I want to raise later on, it's important to recognize that reason, especially in the crucial early modern period that I'm especially concerned with, is not the same as formal logic. Logic was a kind of constraining framework or shell that limbed out some of the main features of reason without actually constituting it. Now, I want this talk to trace some of the early modern concerns about what reason meant, in particular the clear distinction between it and formal logic. Then I'll follow philosophers like Thomas Hobbes as they began to divorce reason from God, and then move into the Enlightenment, when God, as an ontological guarantor of reason, largely vanishes, effectively being replaced by reason itself. Now, to begin with, among various senses of reason that have been routinely employed in the 17th century was a particularly central one due to Thomas Aquinas, derived from the discussion in Aristotle's work called On the Soul, De Anima. Aquinas distinguishes between intellect and reason, and the distinction has to do with the presumed process of deductive inference, as Aristotle explained it in his logical writings. Formal deduction rested on fundamental principles or premises, most problematically what Aristotle called axioms. Axioms were primitive statements taken to be true, from which deductive inferences could be drawn. Most famously, the sort that mathematicians used, like Euclid's and Aristotle's also, the whole is greater than its proper part. Aquinas says that it's the intellect that allows the intuitive perception of the truth of this kind of statement. Without it, you simply couldn't tell that the statement was true. The point is that you can't demonstrate such a statement from something more fundamental, because the statement is already a primitive statement, but at the same time you had to attribute truthfulness to it, or else whatever else you deduced from it would be uncertain. So the idea of the intellect serves here to resolve that difficulty. The intellect just sees that the statement is true in a very basic, unmediated sort of a way. Now the other component, reason, does a similar sort of job. Reason enables the perception that a new deduced statement follows from prior accepted statements, including axioms. Reason is what enables you to say that some conclusion just follows from its established premises. Now here's where reason, even in this specific sense of inferential reasoning, was not the same thing as logic. Syllogistic logic, canonically detailed by Aristotle, took the form of codified rules of inference that enabled an almost mechanical rote application. The taxonomy of types of syllogisms that appeared in scholastic textbooks in this period, in effect, took the thought out of reasoning. All you had to do was follow the rules. And since rote rule following didn't get at the true nature of inference, at how the intellect perceives the truth of an inference, for example, then formal logic couldn't substitute for this mysterious faculty of reason. Now, of course, this position has some serious practical implications. It suggests that when it comes down to it, the force of reason is just that. You're told that something follows, and if you deny it, that's an end of it. That's why phrases like "it stands to reason" have such currency. But philosophical discussions of these matters in the 17th century didn't just stop there. Instead, there was a well-developed idiom, or even competing theories, concerning how to understand the force of reason. I'm going to get my PowerPoint to work. It was the last thing I do. There we go. This is a 19th century rather dreadful painting of an imagined Thomas Aquinas. It's just there for decoration, really. Now, a widely accepted view in this period, common in Catholic countries especially, descended from Aquinas back in the 13th century, and the idea was that we can recognize the truth of axioms, or of straightforward deductive inferences, through what Aquinas called the natural light of our minds. This natural light was an inborn human endowment placed there by God. Aquinas calls it the image of God in man, and he regarded it as what was meant by the assertion that man is made in God's image. Another Latin theological tradition talked about this issue in a similar way, but one that was perhaps a bit less optimistic than Aquinas's. St. Augustine's Neoplatonic Christian theology, which was quite central to Lutheran and especially Calvinist theologies in the early modern period, also assigned a role for divine assistance in the operation of reason. But in this case, instead of God giving man a natural light that would show him the truth on his own, Augustine makes God illuminate the human mind whenever it directly perceives truth. Augustine called this divine light rather than simply natural light. And in that sense, it makes man more directly dependent on God. Each time you see something intellectually, like an inference, it's God who's showing it to you. So on both of these theories, Thomistic and Augustinian, what seems to be happening is that language about God is filling the gap left by what was otherwise an inability to account for how inferential reasoning works. Now, when René Descartes addressed these issues in his early work known as Rules for the Direction of the Mind, written somewhere between 1618 and the late 1620s, he approached reason above all in the guise of a process, ratiocination, or reasoning. Now, reasoning didn't have to be regarded as any kind of faculty, but simply as a procedure. In the seventh of these so-called rules, Descartes stresses the mind's intuitive grasp of foundational axiomatic truths, as in mathematics, and then explains how a process of movement through an entire formal deduction should properly be understood. So this is Descartes. I shall run through them, by which he means the steps of a deduction, several times in a continuous movement of the imagination, simultaneously intuiting one relation and passing on to the next, until I have learnt to pass from the first to the last so swiftly that memory is left with practically no role to play, and I seem to intuit the whole thing at once. So on this view, the human mental ability to reason is not straightforward and automatic in its operation. As Descartes also stresses in his Discourse on Method in 1637, the movement through the steps of the deduction needs to be disciplined by method, albeit in this case a method sanctioned by thoughtful intuitions. There we go. So it's not in the least bit surprising that Descartes also uses the terminology of illumination when he talks about these matters. Everybody else did, after all. Elsewhere in the rules, he explicitly describes the kind of intuition whereby you infer a new statement from a prior set of statements, as in a logical syllogism, as a kind of seeing. You just see that the conclusion follows from what went before. Rule 9 explicitly analogizes mental intuition with ordinary vision, itself a perfectly commonplace trope, but one that tended to invoke the divine and Thomistic notion of natural light. And in his 1641 Principles of Philosophy, in talking about knowledge of efficient causes, Descartes says explicitly that we shall see, with the aid of our natural light, what conclusions should be drawn concerning those effects which are apparent to our senses. Descartes' entire system of metaphysics meant that the metaphor of natural light as the means by which the non-deceiving God ensures our mental perceptions was actually fairly straightforward. So these takes on the question in the 17th century, whether Cartesian or scholastic, were all broadly compatible with one another. But the way that Blaise Pascal, shortly after Descartes, talks about the foundations of reason are particularly clear about what reason was not. Pascal says in his famous Theological Pensée, written in the 1650s, the following. He says, "The knowledge of first principles, space, time, motion, and numbers, is as firm as any of those that our reasoning gives us, and it is on this knowledge of the heart and instinct that reason must rely and must base all its discourse. The heart feels that there are three spatial dimensions and that numbers are infinite, and reason then demonstrates that there are no two square numbers of which one is double the other. Principles are felt, propositions are proved, and both with certitude, although by different ways. And it's as useless and ridiculous for reason to demand of the heart proof of its first principles before willingly accepting them, as it would be ridiculous for the heart to demand of reason a sentiment of all the propositions that it demonstrates in order to be willing to accept them. This powerlessness ought only to serve to humiliate reason, but not to undermine our certitude." Now notice that Pascal's discussion of reason and reasoning here takes those terms to concern deductive inferential reason, of the sort employed in syllogisms or in Euclidean geometrical proofs, the kind of reason that Descartes and others talked about routinely. When Pascal is talking about the heart as feeling basic principles, he's talking about the sort of intuition that makes us believe foundational axioms, the whole is greater than its proper part and all that. Whereas when he talks about reason, he's talking about deductions derived from those principles, and for Pascal, each operates differently. Pascal's general approach is a way of establishing that religious convictions are on a par with the foundations of Euclidean geometry. There's no fundamental difference between the two domains. And not surprisingly, Pascal too talks about natural light in these connections. It's worth noting, by the way, that when Pascal writes about convictions, such as that there are 3 spatial dimensions and that numbers are infinite, he bears witness to the extent to which later Kantian views have much earlier roots. Now, in recent decades, one way of dealing with similar matters in practical terms has revolved around notions of so-called artificial intelligence. Valid inferences can be built into machines. On the face of it, this sounds like an attractive direction to take, until you realize that it runs into a fundamental problem. Only human intuition would be able to decide on which inferences produced by the machine should count as right and which as wrong. And it's in keeping with my overall perspective here that this too was an approach that received serious consideration in the 17th century. Blaise Pascal wasn't only one of the more notable philosophers in the period to consider issues of rational inference and formal reasoning, he's also quite well known for having invented and actually having built for him an adding machine that he invented in the 1640s. Its sets of wheels display base 10 digits, and they were designed to add and subtract, the chief trick being the technical means of carrying numbers. Pascal describes the machine as allowing the performance of arithmetical operations, he says, without any work of the mind. He makes no claim, in other words, that there is artificial intelligence embodied in this machine. Even more than this, Pascal makes no attempt to compare the machine's operations to a person doing mental arithmetic. Instead, the only things he compares the machine to are other technical means of performing calculations. So he stresses things like the ease there is in working with this machine, if you take the trouble to compare it with the methods of working with counters and with the pen. You know how in working with counters, the calculator, especially when he's not used to it, is often obliged, for fear of falling into error, to make a long sequence and extension of counters, and, as necessity constrains him, afterwards to abridge and remove those which prove to be uselessly laid out, in which you see 2 useless troubles with the waste of 2 periods of time. You know similarly how in working with the pen one is constantly obliged to carry or borrow the necessary numbers, and how many errors slip in these carryings and borrowings from long routine and without profound attention anyway, and how the mind quickly tires. This machine relieves whoever operates it from this vexation. It's enough that the operator have judgment. The machine relieves him from weakness of memory. So Pascal understands his arithmetical machine as an alternative technique for performing computations on a par with working on paper or using the then common system of counters, which was a kind of abacus on a table in a sense. His machine chiefly serves to relieve the memory, he says, as well as being quick. And he also mentions that the machine performs these desired operations without its operator even having to think about it. Now, Descartes had already written about the ability to pass in a single movement of thought from premises to conclusions in formal deduction. He spoke about learning, he says, to pass from the first to the last so swiftly that memory, again, is left with practically no role to play, and I seem to intuit the whole thing at once. But here in this case is Pascal attributing a similar virtue to his machine. There's no need to rely on one's own memory, because the machine manages those operations by itself. There's a central and crucial difference between Pascal's perspective and what Descartes had said. The intended outcome of the process, in the case of Pascal's machine, is the result. That's the important thing. Whereas the supposed virtue of Descartes' procedure was that it created an intuition of the correctness of that result. Remember that Pascal stresses that his machine dispenses with the very need for thought. So Pascal's understanding of what computation was all about had little to do with the mind or indeed with reasoning. the mechanical behaviors of the machine as its wheels were turned by the operator could perhaps be seen as analogous to the stages in a deductive argument as Descartes had described them, but for Pascal they had nothing to do with understanding a deductive demonstration. The results of the calculations made with the machine were just that. They were results brought about by appropriately mindless manufacture on the part of habituated workmen and by the grinding of gears. No intuition was needed any more than in performing sums on paper or with counters, or in using 17th century gadgets like Napier's bones. Again, to stress the point, Pascal promoted as the machine's chief selling point, literally he was interested in selling them, the fact that the machine dispensed with the need to use the memory. In fact, the same thing also seems to apply to later elaborations of Pascal's type of machine, including Leibniz's from the 1670s, as well as other kinds of mechanized calculators like Samuel Morland's in England. The crucial point about these machines is that it will be just as easy to build a machine that systematically got its logical inferences wrong as to build one that gets them right. Ultimately, the only way to distinguish them will be to use human criteria, intuitions, of right and wrong. This is particularly clear in a quite remarkable case of a mechanistic account of mental operations proposed by Robert Hooke in the Royal Society in a lecture in 1682. This chiefly concerns what Hooke calls a mechanical and sensible figure and picture of all the actions and operations of the soul. So this is a rather modest ambition on his part, really. Now, of these operations, Hooke specifies apprehending, remembering, and reasoning. These three are equivalent to standard scholastic categories for explicating the soul, in fact, namely the intellect, memory, and reason. Hooke's chiefly concerned in this lecture with what he calls the repository or organ of memory, including human awareness of time. And his basic approach is to distinguish between an incorporeal soul, physically located at a dimensionless point somewhere inside the brain, and the material brain itself. There is a contemporary material brain. Evidently, this draws on the familiarity of Descartes' account in talking about this point in the brain itself, much as Descartes has spoken of the point in which the immaterial mind interacts with the material world. Hooke stresses that the memory is a sensory organ, just as much as the eye or the ear. These are all of them, he says, corporeal organs that the soul makes use of. The items stored in what he calls the repository are ideas. To some degree, these ideas are implanted by motions conveyed into the brain by the senses, but chiefly, Hooke says, by the soul itself. And then he goes on to say this: my notion of it is this, that the soul, in the action of attention, does really form some material part of the repository into such a shape and gives it some such a motion as is from the senses conveyed thither. This repository I conceive to be seated in the brain, and the substance thereof I conceive to be the material out of which these ideas are formed, so that there is, as it were, a continued chain of ideas coiled up in the repository of the brain. Now, these ideas, which have been emitted over time outwards from a central point, according to Hooke, I will suppose, he says, to be material and bulky, that is, to be certain bodies of determinate bigness and impregnated with determinate motions. And as they have their distinct figures, so have they each of them their distinct qualifications of motions and constitutions. Now, the central point from which these ideas are sent out is the soul, which Hooke had previously described as an incorporeal being. But this incorporeal soul nonetheless emits a spherical radiation comparable to the light from the sun. So Hooke says, the radiation of the soul is more powerful upon ideas at a nearer than at a further distance, and their reaction is also more powerful back again, and that in a duplicate proportion to their distance reciprocal, much the same with that of light. I might mention that Hooke was possibly the earliest person to suggest an inverse square law of gravitational attraction. He was keen on it. He describes light, in fact, here as the most spiritual action of all which we are sensible of in the world. So light is sort of a mediation between the material and the immaterial. Hooke describes a sort of resonance between this radiation and the repercussions of the material ideas that it encounters in the brain, analogizing it to the sympathetic agreement, as he says, of musical strings. Another area of 17th century work, by the way, in which it was common to talk about ratio, which means reason. And this is where reason comes in. Hooke's picture of the radiating soul and its interaction with humming ideas in the brain provides his view of what he describes as that action of the soul which is commonly called reasoning. And he says reasoning is the forming new ideas from the comparing the reactions from several ideas placed here and there in the repository, and its being sensible, that's to say the soul's being sensible, of the harmony or discord of them, one with another. In effect, Hooke represents the soul as picking out the conceptual materials that go to produce a deductive inference. Characteristically, Hooke's account leaves unclear exactly how much of this process is due to the free action of this incorporeal soul, and how much is the result of physically determinate interactions between a vibrating soul point in the brain and the equally resonant material and bulky ideas distributed throughout the brain's repository. But the chief function of the soul as an incorporeal thing for Hooke seems to be its use of the will to select which of the resonating ideas it will pay attention to and which ones not. Now, Hooke's quasi-mechanical model, in fact, mirrors closely the usual scholastic and Cartesian account of the difference between reason and intellect. Reason is concerned with producing conclusions, while the intellect judges the principles or premises from which the conclusions are deduced. For Hooke, the incorporeal soul both selects the premises, using the will, and deduces the consequent conclusions, using the intellect. But what's striking is that in this account, the intellect makes these judgments of comparison by its becoming aware of physical harmony or discord located in the brain itself and playing the role of ideas. In Hooke's terminology, all these processes together constitute reasoning as the product of a corporeal engine supervised and guided by an immaterial soul. There's no single thing to be identified as a faculty of reason, except perhaps in some phenomenological sense. But crucially, the soul still steers the boat, and it necessarily transcends the merely material. Reason for Hooke is facilitated by mechanistic processes, but it's still fundamentally spiritual and non-codifiable. Now, perhaps the most determined attempt to reduce method to rote operations and reasoning in the context of method into rote operations rather than something with a mysterious, ineffable core attributable to God and divine light and natural light and things of that sort, is the one found in various writings by Thomas Hobbes. Unlike Pascal or Hooke, Hobbes almost seems determined to dispense with any effective role for God to play in this business at all, or indeed for any transcendental spiritual dimension for reason. In his Leviathan in 1651, here's the famous frontispiece, Hobbes tells us what, in his view, is meant by this word reason when we reckon it among the faculties of the mind. For reason, in this sense, is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed upon for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. But even for Hobbes, this doesn't imply that reason is entirely straightforward, because besides so-called natural reason, there was also the category that he wants to deal with of right reason. Now, in speaking of reason as a mental faculty, Hobbes had echoed the terminology of the Roman writer Cicero, who'd also in fact been the coiner of the term recta ratio, as the Latin for right reason, derived from Aristotle's Greek. Right reason was a rather vague term referring to something like acceptable or sound reason, in the sense of safe or orthodox reason, that didn't lead to uncomfortable conclusions. It's quite a useful category in the 17th century, it turned out. The very popularity of this term right reason shows how far from a mechanical procedure reason was usually taken to be in this period. Now, Hobbes, as we've just seen, gives priority to the act of reasoning rather than the abstract noun reason, and he justifies its priority by examining the term's origins. So he says, again in Leviathan, the Latins called accounts of money rationes, and accounting ratiocinatio, and that which we in bills or books of account call items, they called nomina, that is, names. And thence it seems to proceed that they extended the word ratio to the faculty of reckoning in all other things. The Greeks have but one word, logos, for both speech and reason, and the act of reasoning they call syllogism, which signifieth summing up of the consequences of one saying to another. So for Hobbes, reason was a procedure about which there was nothing magical. It was a matter of comparing statements one with the next and recording their agreement or disagreement. Now, of course, that couldn't in itself take care of the force of reason. Where, after all, did compulsion come into the picture? Again, Hobbes is refreshingly straightforward on the point. The force of reason has to be exercised by a human agent. It isn't something intrinsic to reason itself. And so, again in Leviathan, Hobbes confronts the difficulty of determining reliable reasoning, that's to say, right reason, and why it should be followed. And he takes the most perspicuous sorts of cases, arithmetical calculations, as in keeping an account book, as his central example. He says the problem is that no one man's reason, nor the reason of any one number of men, makes the certainty. No more than an account is therefore well cast up because a great many men have unanimously approved it. Mistakes are always possible, in other words. Hobbes then gently leads his reader to the inevitable conclusion. And therefore, as when there is a controversy in an account, the parties must by their own accord set up for right reason the reason of some arbitrator or judge to whose sentence they will both stand, or their controversy must either come to blows or be undecided for want of a right reason constituted by nature, so is it also in all debates of what kind soever. Well, alas, for most of Hobbes's contemporaries, matters appeared to them a bit more complicated than this. Locke confronted the difficulty directly in his essay concerning human understanding in 1695, and this is what he said. Inference is looked on as the great act of the rational faculty, and so it is when it is rightly made. But the mind, either very desirous to enlarge its knowledge or very apt to favour the sentiments it has once imbibed, is very forward to make inferences, and therefore often makes too much haste before it perceives the connection of the ideas that must hold the extremes together. So the point is that even for Locke, although he doesn't bring God into the picture here, the nature of that perception remains a mystery. A common way out remained the illumination metaphor, but as in Locke's case, explicit talk of God was starting to drop out. At the beginning of the 18th century, a Cartesian lexicographer called Etienne Chauvin made use of an illumination metaphor in ways actually very similar to the old Thomistic and Augustinian approaches, but with the significant difference that Chauvin does it without mentioning God at all. Instead, reason itself provides this metaphorical light. This is what Chauvin says. He says, reason properly illuminates propositions, just as light itself brightens and darkens in turn. Chauvin says that simply giving examples and definitions for some statement is not properly to illuminate it, but at least an occasion to provide that it be illuminated. But as I said, he doesn't rely on God to do that illumination. Reason itself now is the thing, whatever kind of thing it is, that somehow illuminates propositions. In fact, Chauvin fully recognized the essential ambiguities surrounding the whole concept of reason. He writes elsewhere in his Lexicon Philosophicum, 1713, that according to some leading philosophers, this Latin term ratio for reason cannot in fact be defined. And he goes on to explain. And there he is. For what reason is, they say, is sufficiently known to all of us who are distinguished as being rational people. Neither does it matter that reason is on many occasions unknown, obscure, perplexed, for it suffices at least to have in whatever circumstances that thorough overview as is called not unknown. Just as the son of a family recognizes his father, even though he will not have recognized him when glimpsed at a distance, or in shadow, or in the bustle of debate, or disguised in the clothes of a pilgrim or a woman. So this particular chauvinist position seems to be that you know reason when you encounter it, even though there might be accidental circumstances when you might fail to recognize it. But in any case, there's no in-principle difficulty. But Chauvin also knows that not all philosophers hold this position. There were also other meanings to the word ratio than the kind whereby you know it when you see it. The great thing about these various senses of the word, though, was that people didn't always make clear which one they were using in any given case, which enabled much greater flexibility in making arguments using the force of reason. Now, subsequently, in the 18th century, it became quite common to authorize one's philosophical predilections by invoking the notional reasonable man, similar to the English lawyer's reference point of the man on the Clapham omnibus. The reasonable man was often invoked precisely because defining reason as an operational concept was so difficult. D'Alembert says this in the preliminary discourse to the Great Encyclopédie in 1751. He says, "The art of reasoning is a gift which nature bestows of her own accord upon men of intelligence, and it can be said that the books which treat this subject," and he's referring here actually to logic textbooks, "are hardly useful except to those who can get along without them." Now that's a view of reasoning as something that's inadequately formalized by syllogistic logic, and that seems to be something akin to good manners, or perhaps like being in a state of grace. Some people just know how to get it right. So this is the reason of the so-called Age of Reason. Now we're in the 18th century. Reason was then invoked as a justification for decisions of a kind that required value judgments of various sorts that aren't straightforwardly derivable from uncontentious matters of fact. When Michel Foucault, many years ago now, wrote his celebrated History of Madness, he took ascriptions of madness as the dark underbelly of what was taken to be sanity and rationality, but he never really problematized reason itself, perhaps taking it as a sort of instrumental reason of the sort involved in projects of surveillance. As for the legacy of the Enlightenment, the lack of a persuasive account of the reliability of reason once God was no longer its guarantee came to be regarded as a bit of a problem. In many ways, this is where Immanuel Kant enters the story, his importance being not so much he himself as the extraordinary adoption of his approaches by contemporaries and 19th century followers. In saying that our basic categories of apprehension, such as those of time and space, are fundamental to us and are in effect projected onto the world that we experience, Kant explained these basic problems of reasoned inference that 17th century philosophers had addressed by invoking God, by setting them up as fundamental givens that we can't escape. They can't be justified, they just are. At the same time, you also run into the Kantian antinomies. You can just as easily show that the world is bounded as that it can't be bounded. So reason for Kant was certainly not all-powerful. But more importantly, perhaps, it couldn't be justified either. He gives up on justifying inferential practices and just accepts them as the way we relate to the world. Now, not everyone was happy with this solution, of course. A nice example from the second half of the 19th century concerns formal logic. And this is coming back into the Anglophone world, a domain that concentrates the issue of inferential reasoning to its most basic and possibly inadequate core. The idea here was to make logical inferences analytically secure by defining logical operators in such a way as to make logical inferences simply valid by definition, the so-called truth table approach to logic. All this really succeeded in doing, though, as David Bloor has pointed out, was to push the problem back a further step, making it rely once again on intuitions concerning what should count as valid or invalid. So it didn't really get outside the problem at all, any more than artificial intelligence could. It seems to me arguable that the greatest clarity in attempting an analysis of inferential reason lay perhaps in the early modern accounts that invoked divine light, or else natural light imparted by God. It's not to say that I adopt that position myself, but it seems to me to be perhaps the cleanest way of trying to make sense of these problems. When in the 18th century and later reason is treated as self-sustaining, attempts to understand it have been effectively abandoned. And no doubt that's why talk of the force of reason remains rhetorically powerful. It's because it's the brute force of reason which cannot be reduced to anything else. And we may be left with having to say that once again Hobbes was right. Tongue in cheek there, but thank you. Okay, thank you.
Any questions from
Professor Deere, first I'd like to thank you for a very encompassing lecture in dealing with the historical aspects, but it seems to me there's a particular aspect that you touched on but haven't really dealt with thoroughly, and that's the issue of axioms and premises. Because although you've identified how one might use this information, if axioms and premises actually change over time as we get new information, then you might think about these things logically. The conclusions may be very, very different than they were maybe 100 years ago. And I think a simple example would be, say, getting up every morning and watching the sun go around the Earth, and everyone concludes that the sun goes around the Earth. And chances are most of the people on Earth still think that today. But as we've acquired new information, that is no longer an axiom. And in talking about reason, you really have to understand how axioms are generated, how they change over time, and then your arguments, in fact, follow through. I wondered if you would comment on that.
When I was talking about axioms, I was specifically talking about Aristotelian-style axioms, which, of course, are not empirical statements. They're not empirical premises. So they are things like the whole is greater than its proper part and that sort of thing. So I was speaking about that in relation to the issue of what it means to know that statement to be true when it's not something that can be deduced or derived from more primitive statements. Empirical generalizations are another thing again, of course, to do with the way in which one wants to represent routine behaviors in the natural world, a particular perception of the ordinary course of nature, the ways in which nature routinely behaves. It seems to me that that's a distinct issue, though, from the question of either how one recognizes the truth of axioms in the Aristotelian sense, or common notions for Euclid or something, and how one understands the legitimacy of deductive inferences. So that separation from the empirical and experiential side of things seems to me to make that a distinct problem.
Yeah, I think one of the problems seems to be that we can observe reason around us, but also inside of ourselves.
Ah, that's the thing. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if you comment on the macro-micro distinction.
Yeah. That, I suppose, is why, for a long time, speaking of the perception of inferential steps, was itself metaphorically compared to vision. It's just something that you see, and you have this sense in your mind. You just see, yes, it just follows. And there's nothing more you can say. It just is. Now, it seems to me that, in part, what's going on here when that becomes separated to a large extent from talking about divine illumination is that, to some extent, it's not that there are different ways of solving the problem of what reason is, but that somehow, in some sense or another that I wouldn't presume to grasp fully, the sense or meaning of the word reason itself tends to shift. It's not that people decide new things about this thing called reason, it's that the meaning of the word itself tends to be used slightly differently. It tends to shift in its connotations and denotations, which would be something that one would have to track from a more of a kind of a rhetorical analysis than anything else in the way in which people talk about it. One of the striking things, as I said, particularly in looking at the 17th century discussions, where they're helpfully forthcoming in telling us a lot about what the word is supposed to mean, is that they're perfectly happy to tell you that it means all sorts of different things under lots of different disciplinary headings, different contexts of use, and so on. Perhaps that's the best way to understand it.
Sergio?
Thank you very much. Did Hooke's lovely speculative account have any legs? Did people pick it up in any way? Because one of the things I really like about it is it establishes a kind of, well, a non-visual, but also a connection between the ratios and the harmonies and things like that. So one gets to use the old the terminology of ratios while putting it in a nice framework that, and then of course all of the speculation about symphonies in the brain.
Yeah, I'm sure he wouldn't want to have represented it as being mere speculation, but certainly, certainly well-informed speculation. And of course Thomas Willis, with that account of the anatomy of the brain, was very closely contemporaneous with what Hooke was talking about. It didn't, as far as I'm aware, go anywhere in particular. It was, like so many of Hooke's ideas, a bright idea that he threw out there to see if anybody would be interested. And nobody particularly was. But I take it to be a very nice exemplification of the mix of issues that could be brought in together in the 17th century in talking about reason and reasoning, and this I don't want to use the word tension exactly, but I will anyway. The tension between the material and the spiritual or immaterial side of things. And Hooke has both of them in there and juggles with them and tries to make sense of them. He's trying to mechanize as much as he can, but he doesn't want to turn reasoning into simply the action of Pascal's calculator. And it's important for him still to retain an immaterial soul. The fact that he stresses the will, I think, is an important aspect here. Pascal also, in fact, when talking at one point about animals and animal souls, he says, yeah, there are many cases in which animals appear to think just like we do. That's not a big deal, really. What's important, though, he thinks, is the will. The human will is the thing that sets human beings apart from animals. And Hooke also is stressing the will as an important part of what the incorporeal soul does in conducting its reasoning, its thinking. It decides what it's going to pay attention to. It decides what it's going to think about, in effect. And that's the crucial thing, and that's the thing that he cannot mechanize.
But my cat's very like that.
Well, there you go. Willful cats, of course, is the problem.
Professor Deere, could you say something about statistical inference and the new models of artificial intelligence, which abandon the stereotypical classical view of logic and opt for more Bayesian inference, which is what the model, like the brain is supposed to use?
The short answer to that is no, I couldn't. I can probably come up with a more prevaricatory, longer answer. Certainly, the things that I'm interested in specifically with regard to this early modern material are not, of course, getting into that. And even though Bayesian logic has its origins in the 18th century, it isn't obviously a big deal historically at the time of its invention. But again, deciding that particular kinds of inferences are legitimate may be a bit different from the problem, as it was often talked about in the 17th century, of developing this intuitive sense that something counts as a valid inference. Deciding that there's a way of handling propositions that can yield a conclusion, no matter how you do it, whether it's a syllogistic form of deductive reasoning or whether it's using Bayesian logic for that matter. It's not quite the same as saying, it's a way of saying here's how you can get the right answer, or you can argue that this gives you, the best answer or something of that sort. Not quite the same as saying that we understand in our heart of hearts how these steps do it. That's the case with syllogistic logic. It's possible that one could say that Bayesian logic maybe helps one to see how these things are connecting together in a way that those inferential steps in deductive practices in syllogistic logic don't. But that's an interesting point, and I haven't thought of the Bayesian connection.
Question down here.
Thanks for the talk, Dr. Drew. Can you, would you speculate whether modern scientists and mathematicians are sliding in illumination through the back door when they talk about things like the beauty of a solution? So that one of the fathers of modern quantum mechanics went through the math first and said, I find this so strikingly beautiful.
Yes.
It must be true.
Paul Dirac.
Sure, and Occam's razor probably is another example of that. Simplicity has very little to do with mathematics, but mathematicians will tell you that the simplified reason is the correct one. So it seems to me that we're sliding this non-rational, value-laden item in to help justify or convince people of the rightness of a position.
It's interesting, quite what the cachet of the term reason is supposed to be. It seems itself to be rather a historically relative kind of issue, which is why I'm interested in the ways in which these terms are used and the way that the concept, if there is a concept, is deployed, as I say, particularly in the early modern period. And certainly it does seem to be pulling in the opposite direction from appealing to aesthetic qualities of knowledge claims, for example. Although this nice 17th century term, right reason, actually is a classical term, but in the 17th century, the popularity of the term right reason itself maybe speaks to those sorts of things. This idea that right reason is reason that just, it's right. It's not simply reason. Reason is not by itself inherently correct. Right reason is, in a sense, reason that's built on appropriate premises that get you to appropriate conclusions. So it was used in Anglican apologetics a lot in the 17th century. And of course, if you wanted to be careful, you would make sure that you came up with orthodox conclusions from your reasoning, and that was a very good way of making sure that it was right reason. Those sorts of aspects, the bits where the so to speak mechanical stages are not sufficient to get you to some particular desired conclusion, seem to be the places where wiggle room for things like aesthetic judgments in determining whether one accepts particular premises or what it might be, whatever it might be, seems to have some room. And as I said, from a certain aesthetic point of view, I think that talk about divine illumination is a rather nice way of getting at that sort of that psychological aha moment when you see that something just follows. That's all you can do. So God illuminated you, and that's how you know it. And that's as economical an explanation as any, perhaps, if you want an explanation. And then the question is, why do you need an explanation? And that's another question again.
So carrying on from that, and picking up on this wonderfully striking title that you provided for the paper about secular God, is that I'm wondering, is that isn't part of the problem, part of the thing that makes it kind of a tricky word to still have when it has these implications is the implication of a providence in there. And I think that was one of the things that was striking through it, is that the illumination, at least, you know, that aha moment, that has the beauty of providence.
Yeah.
You know, that it's supposed to be there, so that is natural. And then how does that then fit into its continuing use of that aha moment? Because the previous writing notes, there still seems to be that notion that you come onto something true that is illuminated and that's before you, but now what's the teleological reason for that being true? Where's the providence?
I suppose, again, it's the force of reason again. It's brute reason, right? It's true, and it's an irreducible truth. It's like a fundamental Aristotelian style axiom. It just sits there and glows by its own light, as it were, which is actually confusing now the illumination metaphor, I realise. But that's, in a way, perhaps not inappropriately. But I think that's where it stops in many of those early modern arguments. And one of the interesting things is why it shifts, why God tends to drop out in the later 17th century and in the 18th century. And there is more talk of reason as if it were a freestanding, whatever it is. I don't know what ontological category it's supposed to fit into exactly for most of these people. But why reason takes over the job of doing the illumination itself, that is a sort of matter of glowing by its own right, by its own light. In place of God, I'm not sure. Again, it was such an easy sort of go-to solution in talking about reason previously, and for much of the 17th century. It drops away in the later 17th century. As I said before, it seems to me that really what's happening there is perhaps, in a way, reason is gradually being talked about in slightly different ways. It's not that there's a change in ideas about what's going on, as the term itself is somehow being thought of, its connotations are shifting a bit, so that one loses that theological dimension. There's no pat answer that I can think of as to why that happens, but it interests me a great deal.
So a series of hands over there. I'll start with Anna, then Jeff, and then Doc.
So I'm wondering whether you have looked into the 19th century critiques precisely of this sort of untethered reason of the Enlightenment, sort of romantic critiques, or what I'm familiar with, sort of the Russian philosophical critiques of this very notion of a reasoning faculty that's divorced from any sort of divine tethering, or from the human person as a sort of whole person that knows things in very different ways, reason just being one aspect. So I'm wondering if what I'm interested in actually is whether these critics also use reason in the same way that you're thinking of it, in that we all know what we're talking about. When we talk about reason, it's just that we as romantics see that as cold reason, as opposed to the Enlightenment that sees it as sort of force of reason.
Well, I think that the notion of reason compelling assent is an important function for it, particularly in the 19th century. The idea that it's a tool that does your work for you by itself, that you force people to assent to what you want them to do, not because you force them to do it. This is where Hobbes is such a nice commentator on these matters, but because reason just compels you to do it. You can't help yourself. Hobbes knows better. He knows that if you want to force people to agree, somebody has to enforce that agreement. So reason is a special category, I think. It becomes a special category in the wake of the Enlightenment, precisely because it has the force of a blunt instrument, or it's used as if it has the force of a blunt instrument, even though that force isn't scrutinized and analyzed in the same self-conscious way, it seems to me, as was done a couple of centuries earlier. The problems that people found in the 17th century in talking about reason and debated in various different ways are precisely ones that aren't resolved, they're dropped, and the conversation sort of shifts. But still the idea that reason can compel assent is sort of the core that's retained to some extent, hence objections by people speaking from a more sort of the position of romanticism, Goethe and Newton and all that sort of thing.
Let's draft the hand over here and then we can go to
I find it rather striking, this description you give of reason that's integrated in theological apologetics and the reason becoming secular. But it does occur to me that these are part of the story, they might agree, but just interested in your comment on this type of Thomistic understanding of what God represents was of course challenged from within theology itself before God disappears from someone like Hobbes, arguably, from sort of voluntary theology of the Middle Ages into the modern period. So there's God provides a foundation for reason in your account, but reason also provides a foundation for a certain understanding of God.
Yeah.
And a certain theology of God is preconditions for dropping it out of the account of reason. So you could be a serious theist and still sort of accept almost a Hobbesian account of reason and how it operates.
One of the nice examples of that, I think, is Descartes' talk about eternal truths and whether God could have made them different from the way they are, and so on. He gets to that circularity of reason and God's relationship to it, and how is Descartes making these arguments and on what assumptions and so on. Yeah, I think that's exactly right, which is why there's so much hand-wringing in the 17th century in particular. I mean, that's what's so great about it, that people are really actively worrying about these things. But what they end up with doesn't seem to be a solution to the problem, rather a sort of multiplication of ways of talking about reason and understanding what reason is supposed to be in the first place.
I think there was the hand back there.
Thank you very much. It seems to me that God is a check on reason. And by that I mean God serves as a reminder of the limitations of reason in many respects, of capacity or ability to adequately know everything. Think of Socrates here, or even our ability to reason rightly. Think of any number of church fathers. So as reason becomes a secular God, what happens to conceptions of its limitations? If at all, if any.
I think to some extent those sorts of limitations are things that are increasingly being forgotten, I suppose, in that way. As one moves away from God, that's why I use that slightly sort of annoyingly provocative and cute remark in my title about, reason as a secular God. I mean that entirely literally, that there's sort of an aspect of that. The idea that reason, although it doesn't become anything more graspable, takes the place of something that in theological discourse would have had reference to God, and it sort of steals some of the characteristics that would go characterize God, a God, a notion of God. I don't know if that really spoke to what you were saying terribly well.
You sort of left us in the 18th century, which doesn't make me unhappy. I'm completely at ease. And most of the people I spent my life with were very happy with the consequences of the Enlightenment. But in Canada, we had in my last couple of decades fundamental attack on the consequences of the effect of the Enlightenment by John Ralston Saul. And he entitled his book Voltaire's Bastards. I always thought Voltaire was a nice guy. What's your reflection on that?
Oh, well, yeah, that's, of course, a matter of having divided camps. I mean, there are plenty of people now regarding themselves as being on the left, who, people like Margaret Jacob, people like Lynn Hunt, for that matter, historians who want to recover, as it were, the notion that the Enlightenment was a good thing and that the products of the Enlightenment were good rather than bad in the way that some people, particularly philosophers, have tended to attempt to argue by showing negative dimensions to Enlightenment values and so on and so forth. That seems to be a perfectly jolly and happy arena for debate, insofar as people are disagreeing so fundamentally, and that seems fine to me. I don't hold any brief either way.
I think Ralston Saul went deeper than that. He was questioning the supremacy of reason as a way of knowing, as against intuition, emotion, and so on.
Tradition,
I know I've had one turn to ask you a question, and this other one might keep us here for another hour. But would you comment on the idea that reason is the way it is, regardless of what is actually taking place? Because it has survival value. We've evolved to have this kind of mechanism in order to make decisions based on what we see around us. And because it has survival value, that's why we are the way we are.
Yeah, of course, the evolutionary take is always a handy way to do it. The issue there, of course, is how you turn those kinds of practices into language, such that you can say this is an instance of reason in action. Those are the tricks, I mean, where you do that bit.
I'd like to ask a question myself, which is
Ladies first.
which is that in my field, 18th century France, there's a lot of series of works sort of addressing the way various alternative foundational concepts replace theological concepts as organizing categories, so the nation, society, things like that. And you've described this process of the question of the theological foundation of reason sort of going away and reason standing on its own. I mean, could this be described as another instance of that series of replacement concepts, which happen as much because of not because of their force displacing theological foundations, but because of theological foundations, sort of something internal. I mean, much of this literature draws on Marcel Gauchet's work, sort of crumbling on its own, and then the need for foundational concepts to replace those theological foundations.
Certainly, if one thinks of people like Voltaire, for that matter, they have an interest in using the notion of reason and rational arguments and so forth as a political weapon. And so in that sense, cohering it into its own domain which has a legitimacy separate from the state and separate from the church and things of that sort, so from religious arguments, is something that enables reason to be used as a weapon, a political weapon from the outside. In that sense, it's not so much replacing something that existed before as functioning as a deliberately crafted weapon in a contest over what are going to be the supreme categories that carry weight and carry force, as it were, in society. Does that speak to those sorts of things?
Thank you. Well, it just seems to me that having, with God going down the drain and the populace getting smarter, that the status quo had to be maintained. So they came up with this wonderful idea of reason. Okay, God, and I speak as a woman, God's no longer telling us that women are inferior. I mean, we had Eve and everything, but now we just know women are inferior because it's obvious.
Oh,
it's reasonable.
One can make that sort of argument with plenty of cases of European attitudes towards non-Western cultures, and saying we're better than them because we're rational and they're irrational, and representing the ways in which peoples in other parts of the world understand things, talk about things. That's exactly the way one can make that argument.
Yes, so you mentioned Cicero, you mentioned Logos, talking about replacing this Christian God by reason. When would you say that, when would you put Stoic relation?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting thing. I'm going to talk around that because I don't actually have an answer. But one of the nice things, of course, is that particularly in looking at the 17th century, you can find Stoic ideas and Stoic concepts all over the place, and Stoic modes of argument, as soon as you start looking. And I'm sure that can easily be brought into these sorts of issues. I haven't particularly noticed them in the kinds of texts that I've looked at overtly. But I bet that could be done. But I don't have any theories as to what role Stoicism will be playing in discussions of reason in the 17th century, but they must be there, sure.
Any other questions? In that case, please join me in thanking